several things here that gnathostomes have that jawless fishes lack. So these are a bunch of the innovations, or as their word, there's synapomorphy. And if you're curious, there we have a bunch of them labeled there. I'm not going to worry about them. We're going to hit a few of these, but most of these I'm not going to worry about. A couple of them I think are significant or interesting, so I highlighted a few of them. One of them is, and this is soft anatomy, and this is interesting to me, how our neurons work. And you've taken 201, talk about nerve cells in 201 or cell biology, how nerve cells work, how an electrical signal moves down the membrane, right? Remember that? So the axon transmits that electrical signal down the membrane, and it takes a measurable amount of time for that signal to move. In you, for example, you can test this. If you stub your toe really hard or step on a piece of Lego or something, and you know it's going to hurt, but you have 2 to 3 seconds to prepare yourself for it, because that's the amount of time it takes that stimulus to reach your brain. Well, gnathostomes have a much more rapid way of transmitting those signals down the axon, and it has to do with these structures on the nerve cells. These are, remember this, the Schwann cells, the myelin sheath? The axon's wrapped in these cells full of fat. And so when the signal comes, it jumps from node to node. It's like insulators. And in an invertebrate, or this way, the signal has to go all the way down. Or a jawless fish. And so one transition from jaw to jawless, which has nothing to do with jaws, is a much more efficient and rapid way of moving signals around the body. I think that's kind of interesting. And it has to do with these, we call them myelin sheath, right? Schwann cells. Remember that from physiology. How do invertebrates deal with rapid signals? They don't. They don't have very many rapid signals, but one of them is they have giant axons. Because of the physics of how, this is end on, because of the physics of how the electricity moves down the membrane, the bigger the diameter, the faster it moves. But the bigger the diameter, the more expensive it is to make. So invertebrates, these are normal axons in a squid. And squid will have 1 or 2 really big ones running from the brain to the rest of the body. And it can move a real rapid signal down that. And they're called escape neurons. And they're triggered when that fight or flight, when they need to move fast. They got one neuron for doing that. But the regular business is done much more slowly. I don't know why I think that's interesting, but I do. So anyway, there's a series of things there, and let me hit a few of those as we go along. Most of these have to do, again, most of these things, where's the buttons here? Most of these things here have to do with these traits here. Better motility, better sensory biology, more efficient respiration or circulation, all sorts of broadening of the dietary niche.
So the giant axon, is that a synapomorphy for jawed fishes? Or?
No, this is a synapomorphy.
Okay.
Yeah, the insulators.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry that wasn't there. Yeah, see, we do it. Jawless things and the invertebrates don't.
Okay.
So I picked a few of these things, a few of these synapomorphies to play with. So as we're transitioning to gnathostomes here. One is jaws, and we can spend the whole day on jaws, we're not going to. But jaws themselves are the trait. And these are primitive jaws on a shark. And here's the upper jaw, lower jaw, that's the skull, there's the mouth. All right? The structure of the upper and lower jaw are modified gill bars. These are called gill arches. These are cartilages or bones, and between them would be a gill slit. And the most anterior of these gill bars get repurposed into jaws, upper and lower, or structures that support the jaws on the next one back. So I think I have a cartoon here of it, yeah. So jawless fish, these little kidney bean shaped things, those are the gill openings. The water flows through those holes. And these elongate things, those are the skeletal elements. And the anterior-most ones get purposed into structures that either become the jaws, in case of the green here, or a support structure for the jaws. And those are very primitive jaws there. The most primitive jaws we have alive today are on sharks. But in the fossil record, we have jaws that are even simpler than that. So that's the same thing with a different graphic there. This would be a very, very simple set of jaws, where upper and lower, and that next arch back is just starting to take a role in supporting them. So take-home lesson here, the main thing we want to focus on, jaws derived from gill arches. And more important than where they come from is where they led us. And they led us to more efficient respiration. We can develop adaptations to move water more efficiently through the pharynx for breathing. And also, of course, feeding comes along there. We have more different ways we can interact with our food if we can bite it. The jaws, more efficient respiration, and all those feeding niches opened up as well. Kind of in line with that, we're going to move a lot more water now. If we look at, when we look at fish in the lab, we can look at this. In jawless fishes over here, the gills are these little pouches. This is the pharynx, and these are pouches, and they're lined with gill tissue, like little little sacs with an opening and an exit, and water is pumped through there. And that's, you're not going to get a high flow there. That's kind of clumsy, but that's how it first evolved, and that's what jawless fishes are doing. Jawless fishes rearrange respiration. They got a mouth now, and in jawed fishes, gnathostomes, the gill tissue are on these arches with a lot of space, and we can move a lot of water without much resistance through there. More water means more oxygen extraction, less energetic cost. This, we're not getting nearly as much oxygen, and we're moving these pumps to get it through there. So there's gill arches, great shot there of all that open space there, and there's those jaws. As he closes those jaws, that whole mouthful of water gets pushed between these gill arches over the gill tissue. It's really hard, by the way, to find pictures of fish gills that aren't dead fish. And I like to, when I pick pictures, I like to have living things and picture after picture of dead things. Looked and looked and looked for a great picture like that. I'm going to leave this kind of anatomy to other classes, but there's a shark there. Kind of a general principle in vertebrate evolution, actually animal evolution. When you see, again, there's that word improvement. Let's just use it. When you see improvements in the respiratory system, you see improvements in the circulatory system as well. Another way to put that is the respiratory system and the circulatory system are very closely linked. And when one is altered, the other one usually responds. And so with circulation in jawed fishes, we see a more complex heart with a more efficient circulation than we see in a lamprey or a hagfish. So that whole thing I've boiled down a fancy new heart. The sense organs. Sensory biology is more sophisticated now. And one place we see that, there's other places, but one place we see that is here's a jawless fish, a lamprey. And right in the middle of his snout, he's got one nostril. And again, in fishes, the nostril's only about smelling. It's not about breathing. And he's only got one. Jawed fishes, all gnathostomes, have two. And you don't because you're a human, and the sense of smell is not extremely acute in us. But in other animals, having two sensors, that gives us stereo, right? Some organisms can get directionality by which direction the smell is coming from. It's stronger on this side or stronger on that side. We can't do that. At least I can't. But that is a more sophisticated, delicate sense of smell. We have 3 semicircular canals in the gnathostomes, and something I haven't emphasized at this point, but hagfish have 1, lampreys have 2, and everybody else has 3. So we have 3 semicircular canals, and what that means is we have one of those canals in each of the planes of motion. So when you move your head around, you get a lot of information about attitude and acceleration, deceleration from this structure here. You get very precise information. mobility. One places we see mobility, there are other places we see it, but one place we see mobility, here's a jawless fish, a lamprey, poor little guy's been cut in cross-section, and here's a bony fish, a jawed fish. And we see division of muscle masses. The muscle masses in the trunk are the ones that are doing most of the pushing, and if you look at the jawless fish, there's only two masses here, one on each side. They're divided medially. And in all jawed vertebrates, there's four masses. They're separated dorsally and ventrally, right and left. More control, more precision. Jaw, the most visible thing in gnathostomes is the jaws, but another really visible thing is what we call paired fins. These little African catfish. Paired fins. We haven't talked a lot about fins, but some of the fins are called paired fins, and that's because there's one on each side. Like the dorsal fin here, or the fin on the tail. Those are not paired, there's only one of them. But paired fins, there's one on each side. And these show up in jawed vertebrates. We get pectoral fins up front and pelvic fins further back. And these greatly enhance our mobility. And we see them shown up here in the ancestor of the Gnathostomata. What they do, steering, braking, even swimming, they give us many more options than we had without them. So well-developed paired fins with internal girdles supporting those fins, an important trait of jawed fishes. So there they are in a bass, a nice bony fish there, and these are what we're talking about. Braking, steering, maneuvering, sometimes even propelling yourself with them, depending on what kind of fish you're talking about. So these show up as a very primitive jawed fish. They show up in these fossil jawed fishes. They probably weren't very sophisticated, but remember, they were the first to do this. So even though they weren't very efficient or sophisticated, they were better than what other creatures had, more primitive creatures. It's worth pointing out, this is an advanced jawless fish, an advanced ostracoderm, and it seems that the pectoral fins start to show up, pectoral fins, the ones up here, start to show up in the advanced jawless fishes, but we don't have any pelvic fins in jawless fishes. So we can pelvic fins are definitely a trait of jawed fishes. Pectoral fins appear to be starting to show up before jaws. It's a minor distinction that we don't need to worry about. So anyway, most jawless fishes had neither, and this is a typical ostracoderm with no paired fins at all. And I like to liken it to a tadpole. Have you ever watched tadpoles swim? They have no paired fins. It's just propulsion. And I think I found a video of tadpoles swimming. This is what I picture all those jawless fishes like, those ancient jawless fishes. They can't brake. They can't steer very well. They crash into things. They crash into each other. It's just about propelling. But steering, braking, maneuvering is just not something they're good at. And that worked for a very, very long time when no one could steer and no one could brake. But once jawed fishes started that enhanced mobility, again, we talked about this before, the jawless fishes started to disappear. They enhance, the paired fins enhance your ability to control those things there, which is something a tadpole has a hard time with. And if you took flying lessons, you might have dealt with these. Roll, when you tilt sideways, yaw is side to side, but at the head, and then pitches up and down. And these are things that paired fins help you control. Go to an aquarium shop. If you have an aquarium, watch fish. Watch them move. They're masters of that three-dimensional environment. Not at all like this. So, the primitive gnathostomes brought together all pair of fins, both sets, and internal girdles to support them. The bones that are going to become your scapula and your clavicle, the bones that are going to become your pelvis. a shark. The most primitive jawed vertebrate we have today, just think shark. And there's those fins, and there's that internal structure. And there they are on a bony fish. There's the fins, and there's the structures. All right. I'm not going to worry about this. So, bringing these things together, and for each of those things, and we could think of more examples, but we have enhanced abilities in all these areas. You know, a step above what those primitive jawless fishes are able to do. We good? So, more gnathostomes, more acute senses, more efficient respiration, more efficient circulation, broader food niche, better mobility. Let's look at some of the diversity here. Did that. Okay. First group we run into is a fossil group. They're called placoderms. Those primitive jawed vertebrates are generally thought to be placoderms. There's some debate, but let's leave the debate out of this class. There's a placoderm. They're extinct. We've got the girdles and the fins. We've got the jaws. Placoderms were pretty diverse, and they were around for quite a while. They apparently went extinct and left no descendants, so it's not something we can point to and say, oh, you came from placoderm. They brought all these things together, and one thing I think is kind of interesting about them is something, it's a very primitive jawed vertebrate. We think, well, that's a fancy trait, but these primitive things are doing it. They apparently had internal fertilization. And on their fossils, we see a copulatory organ on the males called a clasper. And we'll look at these in sharks when we get our sharks out, which I think is next Monday. But it's thought that these things had a sperm delivery system, a copulatory organ that males carried on. It's called a clasper. We'll look at them when we look at sharks. Sharks have them still to this day. So we think internal fertilization, internal development of the young, you think, oh, that's something mammals do, not these incredibly primitive fishes. So there's someone's view of what it looked like back there in the those Paleozoic oceans. And this is that's what shark claspers look like. That's a modern shark. This is a remarkable fossil, and here's the interpretation of it, is this particular type of placoderm, Mater piscis, which means mother fish, you translate it out. And there's the fossil of this thing, and here's the color-coded one. There's an embryo inside there. So that's kind of neat. And that's placoderms. Some of them got really big. Big enough to bite a bikini-clad woman in half. Not that we'd like to see that. But I've seen this skull. That's about this big. It's a very impressive animal. And there's some idea of size. As big as a small school bus. Or there's one with a diaper. They're extinct. So, placoderms, a cool group. So, placoderms are first gnathostomes. And they're very primitive, and they're completely gone. Here's the rest of the gnathostomes. The rest of the fishes and tetrapods come off this ancestor. And I'm going to boil that down to more complex jaws, etc. There's several traits that show up here, but more complex jaws is a good place to start. Everybody else is defined by that. And look here, the most primitive thing we run into, the first thing we run into, is the shark crowd. So there's placoderm jaws, and there's shark jaws. So they're more flexible, they're more adaptable. We don't have anything with these very primitive placoderm jaws still with us today. They're all extinct. So, class Chondrichthyes. This is generally assigned the right class, so I didn't put the word there, but there's the Chondrichthyes. Let's look at them. We get some out in lab next week. We need some synapomorphies. because that's how I define things. They have a cartilaginous skeleton, made cartilage, not internal bone. And males have claspers, although we're now thinking that even more primitive things had claspers too. But up to now, claspers have generally been thought to be a chondrichthyan thing. We're going to have to revise our thinking on that. And they have a special kind of scale called a placoid scale. And we'll look at these in lab. We'll get our shark specimens up and make sure you run your finger along there. They're tiny little scales that are basically teeth, tiny teeth covering the whole body. Very, very hard, very, very small. And it's a unique chondrichthyan thing, shark thing. The chondrichthyans are the sharks and the skates and the rays and which you're familiar with, and a funny little group of fishes called ratfishes, which you may be less familiar with. A few things about chondrichthyans. They're nearly all marine. About 800 species still with us today, and nearly all of them are marine. Some species enter fresh water. They swim up into fresh water. That's a challenge, by the way. We talked about osmotic issues last time, but moving from marine water to fresh water is a pretty big challenge. But there are some chondrichthyans that will move up into rivers. This is a river. It's the Mississippi, not that fair far up from the ocean. They have shark sightings in places like Cincinnati, which is way up from the ocean. Now, some do enter fresh water opportunistically. Very, very few chondrichthyans are freshwater, completing their whole life cycle in freshwater. There's a small number of freshwater stingrays. Really high-end aquarium shop, you'd see them, but they're like $500. So again, we have this dichotomy. We've got the most primitive living jawed vertebrate, yet many of them are really highly specialized into very narrow niches, like this manta ray here. So don't think primitive and simple are the same thing. Some of their life history traits are presented there. Long-lived, big shark, 70, 80 years old. They grow very slowly, particularly the big ones, and their reproductive output's very low. Fecundity means reproductive output. Remember we talked about this in ecology? You have organisms that are called R-selected or K-selected. Is this R or K? More R or K. R-selected is high reproductive output, lots of small, cheap babies. K-selected is slow reproductive output. You invest a lot in your offspring. This is on the K side of things. So, two major divisions, two major lineages. We have class Chondrichthyes, and there's two subclasses. And again, anything below class, I'm not that worried about in this class, but I have to give them names. So there's our evolutionary tree. If you didn't get those names, we'll get them there in a minute there. There we go. Holocephali, that means half a head, or whole head. Undivided head, holocephali. These are ratfishes. I have some in lab we can look at. Not a big group. They're all marine. They're highly specialized, funny little chondrichthyans. And when you think of it, let's go back here and find a picture of a shark. Find a picture of a shark. Chondrichthyans normally have lots of gill slits, right? Holocephalans have a fleshy gill cover. That's what that means, whole head. It's not divided by gill slits. So they're ratfishes, and they're peculiar little creatures, just an odd mix of primitive traits and highly specialized features. That's just what it says there. They're all marine. There's only about 40 species of them. And one of their distinctive features is their teeth are fused into these very sharp, strong, beak-like features. They eat hard-bodied invertebrates. They move along the bottom, pick up crustaceans or mollusks and crush the shells with those beaks. Yeah. They're just kind of pretty. And there's this guy, you can see his claspers right there. Typically move along the bottom, seeing at hard-bodied invertebrates. We'll skip the video. There you go. That's a deep sea one. using those pectoral fins like wings to propel it through the water. I just found a cool picture of a ratfish egg. All chondrichthyans, again, reproductive output is low, and one of the things it means is pretty large eggs. I think it's about this big. Common one off the west coast here is Hydrolagus. I've seen these brought up in nets, and I've never seen a photograph capture this, but they have these huge eyes, and they're emerald green, brightest green you've ever seen, and it never seems to photograph. I don't know why that is, but it's really striking when you see one that's alive. They come in different shapes and sizes. One with a funny snout there. One with a big, long snout there, rhino chimera. So the other group is the shark crowd, sharks and rays. And these are called elasmobranchs, which means plate gill, elasmobranch. Branch means gill, elasmo means plate. And this is sharks, skates, and rays. More familiar to you, I'm sure. Fossil record of these things is really, really weak. These are some imprint fossils of some chondrichthyans. They're soft-bodied except for their teeth, so they don't leave particularly good fossils, and they haven't been found in great abundance. But one thing about chondrichthyans and fishes in general, but these teeth are really large in chondrichthyans, is fish can regrow their teeth, so when they lose teeth, they grow a new one. And sharks in particular have many sets of teeth, and when one tooth is broken off or worn out, another one just swings into place. And so a shark that lives 100 years is going to drop tens of thousands of teeth. And so shark teeth are quite common in the fossil record. So if you want shark tooth jewelry, be sure it's a fossil shark tooth. Shouldn't be killing sharks for their teeth, so people have jewelry. At Long Beach Aquarium, they do have shark tooth jewelry, but it's all fossil shark teeth. And they're very, very common, and they're very, very cool. And this may be millions of years old, and that's so sharp you could poke a hole in your skin with it still. Just for fun, that's a megalodon, that's a shark tooth. It's a shark, it's extinct species. It's based on its shape, we know it was a white shark, like a great white shark. Megalodon means big tooth. There you go. That is megalodon tooth. We don't have any fossil of megalodon, we just have his teeth. But if you scaled him up, there's a white shark, like a great white shark. If you made a shark with this size tooth, the same shape of a great white shark, that's what you get. That was a very impressive animal. It's thought that it ate whales. There you go, looking at whales. Just some random shark diversity. Big families called Gala, the family Galidae. Big sharks that you're familiar with, the hammerheads and the white sharks. Big pelagic sharks, like this beautiful thing here. Again, if it's that big, that's a big animal, it's bigger than you. That's probably 60, 70 years old. Older than any of us in this room. Some of the sharks are giant filter feeders. The biggest living fishes that we have are these huge sharks that are filter feeders. This is a whale shark. And think about that. Let's go back to ecology. Remember food chains? You know, the plants collect the food down here, the energy down here, and it gets passed up the food chain, right? And every time you transfer the energy from one step to the next, you lose 90% of it, right? That sound familiar? Mm-hmm. The biggest fish in the ocean eats at the bottom of the food chain, right where that's where the food is, the energy. And whales the same thing. The biggest creatures that ever lived eat at the bottom of the food chain. That's a basking shark. Just swims through the water feeding on plankton. This is a shark we get in lab. We get these little dogfish sharks. They're called squalid sharks. The dissection specimens we use in lab, we'll get them. This is just a funny one called a cookie cutter shark, and his teeth are formed in this little cutting plate here, And his niche is he bites chunks of blubber out of marine mammals. So look at this poor whale here, had a swarm of them. And this is the rubber covering on a Royal Australian Navy submarine. Submarines are sometimes covered with rubber to make them extra quiet, and these sharks take chunks of it out, thinking they're chewing into a whale. Some chondrichthyans are adapted for flying through the water with their pectoral fins stretched out like an escape or a ray. Like this little electric ray from off the coast of California here, all stretched out for living on the bottom. Flattened out, not stretched out. Manta ray is a highly specialized filter feeder. These are bony fish, but swims through plankton, feeding with its gills. And that's just magnificent. They're somewhere in the South Pacific, I can't remember where, we should take a field trip. One of those resorts on an island. Their claim to fame is that their resort's on an island with a lagoon, and like 350 days a year you can swim with manta rays if you go there, and people go down there just for that reason. I think that'd be a good field trip. Random bits of chondrichthyan biology to kind of bring some of this together. Chondrichthyans are electroreceptive. That's unusual. There's the structure we talked about them earlier called the ampullae of Lorenzini, these little black spots here. These are electrosensors. They can smell electricity, smell electrical fields. I haven't talked a lot about the mechanics of swimming. Big sharks are power swimmers, and when you look at the anatomy and the shape of the tail and how the body's arranged, that's all about thrust, maximizing the thrust as they move through the water. That's a fish that swims and never stops. Buoyancy, we talked a little about buoyancy last time, but it's worth mentioning again, the chondrichthyans, their main buoyancy adaptation is that enormous liver, and we'll look at them in lab next week. The liver is huge. It fills the body cavity, and it itself is packed with grease. It's oily, so they lessen their density by having this big mass of oil inside their body. Not something you can adjust precisely, but it works for them. I mentioned this earlier in terms of feeding. Their teeth are replaceable, which as mammals, that's something that our ancestors said, we don't need replaceable teeth, and did away with that. But fishes have replaceable teeth, and you can see in the shark jaw here, see how there's so many fossil shark teeth fossils. And here's something I put in here because I want to look at in the lab. Primitive jawed fishes, this is the intestine here, have this thing called a spiral valve. And this is the intestine opened up, and it's like a spiral staircase that runs through the intestine. And the food cycles through there, circles through there. More surface area for absorption, and probably slows the food down as it moves so they can digest more fully. That's a primitive jawed fish thing. The reproduction, we touched upon that. The reproductive output is low. They have low fecundity is the word there. Their offspring are fairly large, like big eggs. That's a shark egg. Or many of them are live bearers. That's a little shark pup being birthed from its mom. And a lot of care, a lot of investment in small number of offspring. That's typical of this group. When you go to the Long Beach Aquarium, if you can, I didn't plan that trip for this summer, but you should go down there. They often have on display shark eggs. The shark egg, it's about this big. And they put a light behind it, and you can see a little developing sharkling inside it. From a conservation perspective, chondrichthyans are mostly sharks, and sharks are carnivores. And you see this again and again in humans and our interaction with other animals, is we don't like predators. Peter and the wolf, Goldilocks and the three bears, the big bad wolf, Jaws. We don't like predators, and we don't treat them well. And This is pictures taken in Oman in the Persian Gulf. And look at this. Look at these sharks. These are all, each one of these is a 60 or 70-year-old animal. Many of them are harvested for shark fin soup. The fin is cut off and the animal's still writhing. It's kicked back in the ocean to die. Shark fin soup is illegal in California now. It should be illegal everywhere. One of the things that makes shark conservation a challenge is A, people hate them, because we hate predators. But these things we talked about. Long life, slow growing, low fecundity. Those are real challenges for conservation. When you knock a population down, it takes a while for it to recover, if at all. So you manage this differently than you manage something like salmon, something that has a high reproductive output. And think about these things. Let's find a better picture. No, I have to go back. These are the top carnivores in the food chains where they live. And remove the top carnivore, you change everything that happens below it. So much of our oceans, they just aren't these big carnivores anymore. So there you go. I touched upon that earlier. We just don't like predators. It's not hard to find pictures of people abusing sharks for no real good reason. These guys are real happy because they killed 4 animals, each with a brain the size of a pea. A lot of this comes from when I was like 14. This book came out, and then the movie came out. And in the 70s were all about killing sharks. I don't know if you remember that because you weren't around. But people were so terrified of sharks that there was this huge backlash against them, and they really suffered. And Peter Benchley wrote Jaws, and he felt really bad. He got really rich, and then he felt really bad. And he spent the rest of his life working on shark conservation, trying to re-educate people. He had created this myth, and he spent the rest of his life trying to undo it. There you go. Sharks with frickin' laser beams. Let's look at bony fishes for a few minutes, and then we'll call it a day. Let's make the transition. Bony fishes. Look, that's a new word there. I'm not going to use that word much again, but I needed to make a definition here. Teleostomy. These are the bony fishes in a broadly inclusive sense. But the other word I use for bony fish is osteichthyes, right? Osteichthyes are all the living bony fishes. We got one fossil group that we have to include, then we get the teleostomes, but I don't want to emphasize that. So here you go. Here are chondrichthyans, we're done with them. Here are the bony fishes, and look at these groups here. There's the teleostomy, includes one fossil group. And then the osteichthyes, the bony fishes, includes everything else. So don't let that confuse you. I'm not going to use teleostomy much, but it's just the bony fishes, including this fossil group. And there's several traits that show up here, and this is the important one, and the only one we'll focus on. A bonioperculum. A bonioperculum. You might call it a gill cover, but let's call it by its proper name, bonioperculum. The ancestor of the teleostomes develops a gill cover and covers the gill chamber up with this bony plate here. That protects the gills, but that's probably not the big deal there. The big deal here is with this gill cover, a much more efficient respiration mechanism can be evolved. And if you watch a fish in an aquarium shop or at your aquarium or anywhere, you watch a fish breathe, you see open their mouth, they take a mouthful of water and then they close their mouth, and that gill cover opens up and the water goes back out. So this allows a really efficient pump from mouth to gill slit, from mouth to gill slit. So again, we're stepping up our ability to extract oxygen more efficiently and more rapidly. So there's the old way of doing it. Sharks don't have an efficient pump for doing that. But there's a primitive teleostome. He's got a pump now. And that was a big step forward. So, here's just the teleostomes. Okay? And we got one cool fossil group we want to play with. And then everything else is an osteichthyon. One cool fossil group, and they're called acanthodians. Spiny sharks. They're not sharks, but they kind of look like sharks a little bit. They have some shark anatomy, so they get that name. Acanthodian means acanthos is spine. That's through the spine. This is a fossil group. It's entirely fossil. Their evolutionary placement is subject to a lot of discussion, which we don't need to worry about. There's a pretty neat diversity of them. They're all gone. And they were mostly fairly small. We're talking small minnow-sized fishes. And like I said, they're the most primitive teleostome, so they're possibly the most primitive bony fish. But there's a lot of debate as to exactly what they are, and those debates don't concern us a whole lot. They've got a puzzling combination of characters and traits that make them very different. Like some people say, oh no, they're really closely related to sharks. Other people say, no, they're way over here by the bony fishes. We're not going to worry about those arguments at all, but we do need to touch upon them. So there's an evolutionary tree and an attempt to bring order to them, and we'll just, if I say, very confusing. It's probably not one group. It's probably not one monophyletic group. It's probably 3 or 4 monophyletic groups. But what they are is, like I said, the earliest bony fishes. And one of the things they have that get them their name is their fins are set off by these big, thick spines. That's what spiny shark comes from. And we often have just the spine in the fossil record without the rest of the animal. The rest of the animal didn't have a bony skeleton. So often we just get these big spines. These big spines, some of them are very, very old. They also have very distinctive big armored scales that are just also show up in the fossil record rather abundantly. So anyway, sorry, allergies are hitting me. Acanthodians. Main thing we want to focus on, they've got this operculum, this gill cover, and they're the first bony fish that we know of. Everybody else is a true bony fish. It's just, we're done with the acanthodians, they're right here. Everybody else is osteichthyon. And osteichthyes means bony fish. And that's fishes, and that's you too, the tetrapods. So we call those the true bony fishes if we call teleostomes bony fishes. We don't think to worry about that. So there you are, true bony fishes, osteichthyes. Almost everything you think of when you think of a fish. We touched upon these, it seems like a couple hours ago on our transatlantic flight. Touched upon them a while ago. Osteichthyes come in 2 basic flavors, 2 basic types. Osteichthyes is a class, these are subclasses, but again, the ranks are confusing. There's one group called the ray-finned fishes, and they're distinctive ray fins. These little structures here are called rays. And there's another group called lobe-finned fishes, and their fins are at the end of little lobes, or stumps, or limbs, however you want to think about that. Here's what defines these guys. In these ancestors, lungs evolved. Lungs for breathing air. And an endoskeleton. Let's look at that. An internal bony skeleton. It's the first time we've seen this. An internal bony skeleton. All this stuff here. It's made of a kind of bone, I'm not going to emphasize, it's called endochondral bone. It's a new kind of bone, too. So the osteichthyons have an internal bony skeleton, and if you think about that, the ostracoderms were armored. They had bone too, but it was a different kind of bone. So we've had bone up to now, but with osteichthyons we have internal bone. And then there's this thing that's a little confusing. That's a lung. A lung. ancestral bony fish probably evolved in a swamp or a wetland, evolved in habitat where oxygen was poor. And that's the best picture I can find of it. That's a fish lung. And I've got some fish in the lab when we do our bony fish dissection. I can show you some fishes with lungs. That was for breathing. And these guys evolved in habitats where they would take breaths of air. There are fish today still do that. Not very many, but there are a few that breathe with them. They had gills, but they're in low oxygen water, so air breathing was favored. Now, most fishes don't breathe with lungs today. That's an ancient, old-fashioned way to do things. But the lung is still around in most bony fishes, most osteichthyans. It's that thing we talked about last time called the swim bladder. That structure is about buoyancy. That is derived from a lung. So if we go back here, the ancestor of the osteichthyan, the true bony fish, invented a lung, which later gets repurposed into a swim bladder, and internal bone, an endoskeleton. Okay, so osteichthyes, these are the bony fishes minus tetrapods. You're an osteichthyan as a tetrapod, but we'll cover them later. There's our evolutionary tree. There's two flavors here. We just touched upon those. Actinopterygii. Actinopterygii are the ray fins. Look at the Greek word here, derived from Greek. Pteros. Pteros is wing or fin. Can you figure those ancient reptiles that flew? Pterodactyls, right? Actino means spine or ray. There's some genera of cactus that have that in their Latin name, actino, because they're spiky. So spine or ray. So spiny fin or ray fin. That's these guys. And that's almost everything you think of when you think of a fish. And then there's the lobe fin fishes, and again, their fins are at the end of these little stumps. These are really primitive bony fishes, and their fancy biology word is Sarcopterygii. Pteros again, that's wing or fin, and sarco is lobe or stump. Okay. All right, I'm going to call it a day here. A little bit early again, and I'm going to go, here's my voice. I'm going to go over and I'll see you in about an hour for lab. So go sit down for a few minutes, breathe some fresh air, maybe get something to eat. See you in about an hour. If you have any questions, bring them up. What you got? I assume some of my board members I'm saying they don't have a transfer mechanism. Yeah, pretty sure. Say what? Oh, sorts of about 250 years old. But no, I don't know. It could be on your body, but I could be.
What is your name? Melissa, thank you for the. You guys push together so that way it's
Are we normally doing them in lab? Like,
easier. We do it in lab.
we do, but this time was just. Oh, look. At least it was a terrible day. You like want to go over? Again. No, like serious.
Okay, so.
Oh, sorry.
So, the question I have is, do you want to start the
Soon, I'm going to take this.
Yeah, go for it.